Discover how a single spice drove empires to war, funded genocide, and made nutmeg the most dangerous commodity in the history of global trade.
Chapter 1. The Scent of a Plague Cure. This story does not begin in the stuffy, exotic-smelling tropics on sunny beaches covered with palm trees, but in the unimaginable dirt, terrifying darkness, and rotting heart of 17th-century Europe, where the streets of London and Amsterdam flowed with gutters full of sewage, and the air was so thick with the stench of death that it could almost be cut with a dull knife. It was here, in the shadow of the great Gothic cathedrals and crowded wooden tenement houses that seemed to lean towards each other like conspirators, the Black Death took its gruesome toll, becoming a recurring, never-ending nightmare for millions of people who woke up every morning in panic, checking their bodies for black buboes. A wide shot of a London street, shrouded in thick yellowish fog, shows a scene straight from the darkest visions of Dante's Hell, where the pale, cold morning light barely breaks through the curtain of smoke from burning bonfires, lit in a vain attempt to cleanse the poisonous air known as miasma. In this gloomy landscape, painted as if by Rembrandt's brush, where deep, velvety shadows contrast with sharp, directional light, a cart with the bodies of plague victims rolls slowly over slippery, wet cat heads, and the wooden wheels creak eerily to the rhythm of the monotonous ringing of a bell, which is the only requiem for the dead. The smell of decay, damp earth, and burning wood mixes into a thick, suffocating suspension that penetrates every lung, every pore of the skin, making fear an almost tangible substance that settles on the hair and clothes of terrified residents hiding in their homes. This image of overwhelming hopelessness forms the foundation of a world where absolute despair searches for any anchor, any glimmer of hope in the darkness that seems to be engulfing entire civilization and forcing humans to seek salvation in the farthest, least explored corners of the globe, where plants are said to grow with the power to challenge the costa itself, opening the gates to a new era of madness and greed, where human life loses its sanctity in the face of economic calculation.
In this world devoid of any hope, where frantic prayers seem to echo off a leaden, smoke-filled sky, and church and scientific authorities are as helpless as a child in the fog, the ghostly silhouettes of plague-stricken doctors stride among the bodies of the dying and dead in long, habit-like cloaks onto the desolate stage. A close-up on the leather mask of one of the medics shows the fascinating and at the same time deeply terrifying details of this primitive hermetic armor. The thick skin, cracking with moisture, repeatedly impregnated with hard wax and animal fat, gleams ominously in the light of a flickering lantern, and the glass round visors reflect the flames of bonfires dying out in the street, giving the figure an inhuman, gigantic bird appearance. The long, ghastly beak of the mask, resembling the muzzle of a carrion raven, is not only an element of a deliberately created grotesque costume intended to scare demons, but also plays a key role as a desperate filter, saving the life of a doctor in an environment of absolute pollution. It is extremely tightly stuffed with natural sponges soaked in wine vinegar, dried rose petals, sharp-smelling camphor, and above all, the most precious of all, ingredients considered a panacea, freshly grated nutmeg. It is this very intense, warm and spicy scent, pungent and almost intoxicating to the senses, that is intended to neutralize the deadly, disease-carrying miasmas, creating an illusory, invisible scent barrier between the doctor's delicate lungs and the rotting, decaying outside world. Although, in the tragic reality, these archaic methods are completely useless against the plague bacterium, invisible to the naked eye, transmitted unnoticed by bloodthirsty fleas feeding on black rats. This dramatic scene full of rough textures of leather, glass, and fog, makes us realize the profound ignorance of the science of the time and the extent of the desperation with which they tried to protect human life with aromatic shields, creating a powerful subconscious connection between the strong smell of exotic spices and the chance of surviving the apocalypse, which forever changed the perception of aromatic seeds in the eyes of terrified Europeans.
This complete, devastating helplessness of the medicine and religious authorities of that time in the face of the monumental scale of human suffering and mass unexplained death is an extremely fertile ground on which, from tiny seeds of desperation whispered from mouth to mouth, a rumor begins to sprout at an alarming rate, at first quiet and timid, exchanged furtively in the dark, snotty alleys of London and Amsterdam, which, however, quickly and irreversibly turns into a fervent, even fanatical belief. In the exhausted minds of millions of people gripped by the daily paralyzing horror of the inevitable end, a strong belief is born that there is a miraculous salvation from the plague air in the world, and it is this rare, strangely wrinkled brown seed coming from the other side of the world, from mythical, unknown islands, whose spicy aroma supposedly has incomparable magical power to drive away the vapors of the plague and cheat the ghostly death itself. Suddenly, within just a few months of the intense terror of the plague, nutmeg is no longer treated in the markets as merely a culinary curiosity or an expensive spice to spice up dishes. It becomes a true talisman, a sacred relic that protects against destruction, a material promise of waiting for the next sunrise, and its physical possession is absolutely equivalent to holding one's own, extended indefinitely in one's trembling hands. Life, which triggers in terrified people, first desperate grasping at straws hope, and soon followed by insane, insatiable, and murderous greed. This psychological shift from the absolute depressing fear of disease to the absolute desire to have a cure at all costs becomes the driving force of a new era in which morality and ethics give way to the brutal laws of supply and demand, and a rumor born in the dirty gutters of an infected city gains a force more powerful than the decrees of kings, capable of stirring great war fleets and forcing thousands of desperate people to leave their homes and go in search of salvation beyond the horizon of the world they knew.
From the hectic streets of London, the narrative takes us abruptly to the extremely contrasting, rich, even sterile, clean and luxurious house of a Dutch merchant in the heart of mighty Amsterdam, where the atmosphere, although at first glance completely devoid of the direct sight of corpses lying on the pavement and ubiquitous dirt, is still deeply and irreversibly permeated with the same invisible, paralyzing fear of a silent enemy entering unnoticed through closed doors. The interior of this stately residence is reminiscent of a painting painted by Master Vermeer come to life. Here we see extremely elaborate, rich oak wall panels shining with beeswax polishing, soft golden light barely falling through the artfully assembled stained glass window made of thick glass, illuminating the myriads of dust particles lazily dancing in the thick air, and the overwhelming, almost overwhelming splendor gathered around material goods, silks and porcelain, which, in the final face of the striking plague, lose any real meaning and value if they cannot ensure their owner's naked survival. In the center of this carefully choreographed scene stands a terrified, powerful patrician, dripping with cold, sticky sweat, dressed in exorbitantly expensive, heavy burgundy velvets and snow-white Flanders laces, who, with both hands, until his knuckles turn white, clutches on his chest an exquisitely made, extremely expensive silver pomander, an intricately carved, open-work spherical pendant studded with precious stones, inside which, on a satin pillow, rests a huge, perfectly spherical, selected nutmeg, constantly emitting its deep, spicy, suffocating aroma through silver grates. The wealthy merchant, in the moments of his greatest panic attack, violently presses this cold, carved metal to his plump nose, inhaling the scent of the spice so deeply and greedily into his lungs as if it were the only crystal clear and safe air left on the rotting earth, sincerely and naively believing in the depths of his pained soul that this exotic, warm scent magically creates around his rich body an impenetrable armor, invisible to the human eye, a shield protecting against all ail disease that makes him personally untouchable and an immortal god among the dying masses.
When the time of the evening supper finally comes in the house of an Amsterdam patrician, the process of adding this priceless spice to rich, fatty food is no longer an ordinary common culinary activity aimed at improving the taste, but with its anointing and setting, it resembles almost the most sacred, magical religious ritual performed before the gods. The head servant, dressed in an impeccable, stiffly starched livery, with his eyes downcast in humility and his hands visibly trembling with concern, solemnly approaches the table and uses a tiny grater, specially cast from pure silver and intricately engraved, to, with the utmost reverence, slowly grate just a few microscopic particles of this wonderful, hard brown seed onto the lying surface on a platter, steaming roasted game meat. Every tiniest rust-colored speck swirling in the candlelight falling on the lavishly set table is watched with bated breath and morbid attention by all the guests gathered in the dining room, and the sharp, woody, sweet, slightly peppery smell that hits the nostrils in a split second and immediately mercilessly fills the entire huge dining room is the smell of extremely desired status, unimaginable, infinite wealth, and, most importantly, ultimate, cruel in its essence, a triumph over the dirty, ignorant populace. This aristocratic, safe society enjoys the smell of delusion with full and cold awareness of the fact that behind the thick walls of their tenement houses, hundreds of poor people are dying on the cold, muddy streets in the agony of shortness of breath and bursting buboes, unable to afford even the fine, crumbly dust of this foreign miracle, which gives the dishes eaten an additional, extremely perverse flavor of the survival of the elite at the expense of the absolute exclusion of the poor, showing the dark, ruthless side of early capitalism.
From the stuffy and arrogant silence of a candlelit Amsterdam dining room, we return brutally outside, once again immersing ourselves in the icy, dirty, pulsating with overwhelming chaos and hidden violence hidden beneath the surface of the London supply market, where the daily trade in exotic spices resembles much more a bloody, ruthless fight to the death for biological survival than a civilized, trust-based trade transaction. And in the humid air there's a heavy tension, so thick and palpable that you can almost see it sparking between the gathered people. The 10th scene, captured as in the paintings of Dutch masters using strong chiaroscuro, focuses on a small, dirty, rickety wooden counter behind which stands an obese spice merchant, sweating from nerves and effort, whose swollen face is covered with street dust, and in his small, piercing eyes shines the inhuman greed and absolute ruthlessness of a man who is perfectly aware that he has in his exclusive possession a commodity much more valuable than the fragile human life itself. On a classic brass weighing scale, whose shiny arm swings steadily and mesmerizingly, building the drama of the moment, lies on one side on a brass plate just 1 pitiful pound of small, wrinkled, completely inconspicuous brown nutmeg seeds, which in appearance and texture resemble the most ordinary sun-dried common nuts, but of which to the discerning nose there is an extremely subtle, deceptive, and warm scent that immediately promises magical salvation from the plague. On the opposite scale of this merciless scale of market justice suddenly lands with a loud, heavy, dull, and metallic clang a huge leather purse stuffed to the brim, from which, under the impact, suddenly spills onto the blood and mud-stained table a veritable mountain of heavy, solid silver coins, shining coldly in the dull, misty morning light like the dangerous teeth of a predator ready to attack slowly but surely. The inexorable, physical, overwhelming weight of the accumulated silver is balanced by only a handful of light seeds, creating a visual image of such an absurd, even grotesque disproportion of values that fully exposes the madness of the era and the irrationality of the human fear of death converted into the hardest currency.
This shocking contrast and the astronomical value of that single humble pound of overseas spice, which now rests proudly on the scales, far, even exorbitantly, exceeds the amount that the average hard-working and honest London dock worker, cab driver, or tired suburban farmer can earn in the full half of his difficult year, working in slavish toil and drudgery from the crack of dawn until the deep dusk. This brutal mathematical conversion of money into medicine clearly and finally makes the observer realize that the natural, divine right to live and take care of one's health in the brutal times of a raging plague was completely, without any scruples, privatized by the merchant elite and became an exclusive, desired luxury available absolutely and exclusively to the richest, most ruthless layers of the then highly stratified society. The sight of shiny silver in front of dry seeds becomes a powerful, silent testimony to the growing social inequality and economic exploitation, clearly indicating that the smell of security has a hard, indisputable market price paid in blood bullion, and for those who cannot afford it, all that remains is a slow, painful suffocation under a thick layer of stinking urban miasma, amidst a general indifference to the suffering of the weak and the poor, who fall like flies on the commercial streets of cities, fertilizing the cobblestones with their blood.
It is in this desperate, raging crowd, tightly surrounding the wooden stall of an obese trader, among brutally jostling bodies, in the stench of sweat, and among the greedy, guttural screams of rich, soulless merchants bidding, that an extremely moving human drama takes place, which constitutes the deepest emotional and tragic heart of this cruel era. In the very center of the market, we see a desperate, devastated by long-term hunger, extreme poverty, and the overwhelming fear of the mother, whose worn-out clothes are now only dirty, poorly stitched gray rags that provide no warmth, and her gray, emaciated face is a living mask of absolute, soul-destroying and eye-burning resignation, bordering on madness. This incredibly fragile, life-broken woman, with the remnants of her miserable strength, breaks almost on all fours through the dense, impenetrable wall of tall, wealthy, and brutal bodies of merchants, completely indifferent to her fate, finally reaching the currency exchange office and holding in her desperately stretched out towards the scales, her sickly, trembling hand, just a few small, worn, rust-green, worthless copper coins, which certainly constitute all her wealth from her entire brutal life. Crying hysterically, the woman begs the cold, impassive trader for just one, the smallest, perhaps broken and missing little seed of this wonderful nutmeg for her little child, who is dying alone in a cold, dark, damp house, on whose pale, thin neck the first dark, swollen, and painful black swellings of the lymph nodes have already appeared in the morning, an unmistakable 100% sign of the approaching at a rapid pace and in the terrible agony of the grim reaper.
The monster dealer, busy counting the silver coins, does not even spare her a fraction of his contemptuous glance. With a loud, dismissive, hoarse snort, and with one quick, brutal movement of his huge, greasy, dirty hand, with powerful force, like a bothersome insect, he violently throws her aside into the crowd, brutally throwing her meager savings straight into the stinking mud, full of manure and human excrement. The gutter where the last copper coins irretrievably drown in the dark waste, and the beaten woman falls helplessly on the sharp stones to her knees, bending in half and howling horribly to the sky in complete, helpless animal despair, fully and finally aware that the lack of enough gold or silver in her purse means at that moment the final and irrevocable immediate sentence of a cruel, slow death by suffocation due to buboes for her only beloved child.
This incredibly heartbreaking, cruel, hopeless, and brutal economic truth market scene represents a fundamental and crucial turning point in our broader historical understanding of the comprehensive, absolutely universal appeal of this amazing, magical spice from the East Indies, which in fact was not treated by Western societies of the time solely as this legendary, almost divine, miraculous medical cure saving humanity from the deadly, unyielding plague of bubonic plague. We quickly learn, by analyzing the conditions of the era more deeply, that its broad, everyday, seemingly only culinary use and gigantic, undying desire among the masses of people reached their roots much, much deeper into the very foundations and everyday, trivial problems and fragile structures of survival of the entire 17th century European society, irreversibly reshaping its eating habits, everyday fears, desires for luxury, and ways of coping with the brutal reality. Nutmeg was a polymorphic substance that not only soothed the murderous, paralyzing fear of infectious death, but also, which was equally important, offered a practical, almost miraculous, magical solution to other common nightmares and inconveniences of the then very primitive, from today's point of view, existence, where every day without food poisoning or starvation was treated as a small personal miracle prayed to God himself. To fully understand this phenomenon, we must immerse ourselves in a dirty, stinking world that absolutely did not know the benefits of electric refrigerators, cold rooms, artificial ice in the summer, or any modern and effective chemical methods of preserving, pasteurizing, or sterilizing food, which made it a world where freshly trimmed, raw animal meat left in a warm room literally immediately began to rot violently, spread a dead odor, and quickly become covered with disgusting, thick swarms of large black and green flies just in a few short summer hours right after the bloody slaughter in the slaughterhouse. In such Spartan, unhygienic living conditions, the wonderful nutmeg, due to its strong, unique chemical and antibacterial properties, turned out to be an amazing, incredibly effective, even heaven-sent, magical food preservative, which in an unprecedented way was able to significantly, by many weeks, extend the safe suitability of this valuable food for human consumption, and save the accumulated supplies in the most difficult period. What else, in home practice, was much incomparably more important was that its incredibly strong, pungent, extremely sharp and hard flavor, dominant in every spice mixture, and its paralyzing, pungent aroma were, with great, flawless effectiveness, able to completely and permanently mask the hideous, nauseating odor and sour taste of the already slightly, noticeably spoiled, greenish, spoiling and decaying meat. This extraordinary phenomenon of masking the smell of rot without any problem or consequence, allowing people, especially those slightly poorer, although they could still afford a pinch of spices, to regularly eat these long-cooked or baked meat dishes, which otherwise, without its rich and generous aromatic addition, would immediately cause violent, bloody nausea, uncontrollable vomiting, and severe, often fatal food poisoning, which on a daily basis
in a brutal, obvious way, made this little ball a highly strategic, priceless raw material that facilitated direct biological survival of the harshest, long European winter without starving to death due to the spoilage of winter supplies in the cellars.
Moreover, as we climbed higher and higher up the social ladder, in the highest, most exclusive, hermetic circles of the aristocracy, and in the gold and silk royal courts of contemporary Europe, the ostentatious, excessively abundant, deliberately exaggerated use of this difficult-to-find, very expensive, end-of-the-world exotic spice in dishes very quickly and naturally became the loudest possible, vulgar and visible signal indisputably indicating the unimaginable, bottomless wealth, powerful influence, and the dominant, unquestionable social position of a ruler or nobleman who conspicuoused his rivals with his wealth. Huge whole roasted meat dishes, dripping with fat on the grill, such as wild boars, deer, or pheasants, were literally sprinkled on the tables with an incredibly thick layer of freshly grated, fragrant knob, visible from a distance, almost like brown, precious snow covering the meat, which was intended with incredible arrogance to clearly and finally demonstrate to all those invited to the banquet and to the shocked guests that the host was without the slightest problem. He could afford to cynically waste a gigantic fortune, the value of which was difficult to fathom, solely and exclusively for the vain, fleeting, and momentary pleasure of his own refined palate, and to the amazement of his flatterers. As if this absolute and terrifying wealth attributed to the plant were not enough to arouse madness in people, the lewd legends and fairy tales of travelers from overseas, whispered loudly, repeated in secret, with flushed faces in stuffy boudoirs, huge canopied beds and luxurious palace bedrooms, gave nutmeg another, extremely powerful, almost mythical property that immediately, like a spark to the dust, fueled and drove this insane market demand to even higher limits of total absurdity. It was believed strongly and with full, unwavering religious conviction in their hearts that this seed was an extremely powerful, most effective aphrodisiac on the planet. Doctors and alchemists, and therefore the nobility, were convinced that the knob was magically capable of miraculously awakening the greatest animal and wild desire in a person, previously unheard of in the body, quickly curing every form of embarrassing impotence that plagued kings, and forever providing superhuman, youthful, vigorous vitality to decrepit, tired of life and old people who still wanted very much to keep very young, hot lovers in his arms, which finally and definitively in those centuries made this little ball an extremely desirable substance, sought after and bought for its weight in gold, not only to purely save lives from the bubonic plague, but also to fully satisfy the most wild and primal reproductive instincts of men on its own terms.
When we look at it as a whole from a distance of time, we begin to understand this unimaginably complex, even deadly and crazy combination of such extreme psychological and social conditions. The panicky, animalistic, mind-numbing fear of a silent and slow death at the hands of the bubonic plague, the desperate need to preserve and mask rotting food in the primitive conditions of winter, the obsessive, snobbish, even arrogant desire to constantly manifest one's wealth above other people's, and the untamed, mind-burning desire for superhuman sexual potency in old age. All this combined to create a real, uncontrolled sociological and economic explosive mixture that, like a mighty volcano, exploded in Europe, forever shaped the global economy of that early emerging capitalist period, and marked new sea routes on previously unknown maps of the world. It is precisely in this deeply dark, extremely brutal for the weak, terrifying and engulfed in chaos and superstition world of people who are unaware of the causes of the plague that the complete and final answer to our fundamental question posed in this book, why, is finally born. Why, for God's sake, it was this inconspicuous, ugly brown seed, resembling the dried, crumpled testicle of a sick animal, that became the world's greatest catalyst for the absolutely greatest and bloodiest possible geopolitical changes of that wonderful and terrible era, and led humanity smoothly and without any remorse to the brink of bloody madness and total sea murder. Here we see in all its full glory that completely ruthless and absolutely insane, fueled by a paralyzing, visceral fear of the plague, air, and the completely unlimited, insatiable greed of the elites, economic demand on a global scale, a demand that easily made powerful, European, and well-behaved Christian kings, fat bankers counting their profits in Florentine banks, and daring seekers of limitless adventure or treasure, common and with a smile on their faces, willing to risk literally everything they had, sending dozens of fleets and thousands of young men in wooden shells to a highly probable, almost certain, cruel death from scurvy, and sinking into the black, stormy, cold, and terrifying depths completely unknown to them in the wild oceans to the east and south. A complete and deep understanding of the nature of this great worldwide spice madness, penetration into this extremely deep, primitive, dark and unresolved human nature, the boundless desire for wealth and salvation since the beginning of the world, finally explains to us brutally why the proud, rich, supposedly civilized and so highly educated European white men of those proud centuries were able to bravely get on board with a ruthlessness unimaginable to us today, creaking decks of small, fragile, massively sinking wooden galleons, armed with heavy cannons, sail eagerly straight into the complete darkness and storms of the sea, heading towards the unknown edge of the known, previously known world, and ultimately commit unimaginable crimes, ethnic cleansing, cruel genocides rhyming with the massacres of antiquity, and a creation of merciless institutional slavery of the peoples of the East, and all only to gain permanent monopoly and total world control over the extraction and trade of just this one tiny brown seed that has been growing in abundance for millions of years on the tiny green Indonesian Banda Islands, hidden under the sky in the east, with their greedy and bloody hands.
Chapter 2. The Secret Garden of the World.
To fully understand the unimaginable contrast that struck the senses of everyone who was lucky or unlucky to reach this place, we must first leave behind the gloomy cities of 17th century Europe, shrouded in thick, acrid fog and permeated with the smell of decay, mud, and burning coal, where winter seemed to last forever and the prospect of human life was as short and brutal as the blow of a blacksmith's hammer. Now imagine the endless, terrifying emptiness of the ocean, months spent in the dark, damp, and musty bowels of wooden galleons, where every day was a fight against scurvy, madness, and omnipresent death, to finally, after crossing the borders of the known world, see the heavy, leaden clouds suddenly part, giving way to an absolutely breathtaking, heavenly vision. From the perspective of a bird's-eye view, suspended high in the crystal-clear air vibrating with heat, the Banda Archipelago appears as a precious emerald necklace thrown by the careless hand of the Creator onto the endless velvety blue of the ocean, whose waters shimmer with thousands of shades of turquoise, azure, and deep navy blue. In the very center of this volcanic microcosm rises the majestic, menacing, and at the same time mesmerizing Gunung Api cone, whose slopes are covered with a jungle so dense, dark, and vital that it almost seems to be a living, breathing organism. The cinematographic vision of this place is reminiscent of the most masterful canvases of the Dutch Golden Age, where light and shadow are in constant, dramatic battle with each other. The fierce orange and blood-red rays of the setting sun cut through the heavy, humid air, casting long, deep, and velvety shadows on the calm waters, while the peaks of the volcanoes seem to burn with an internal fire, creating an atmosphere of monumental, epic peace that hides in its very core a disturbing, dark secret. It is here, on these only 10 tiny specks of land lost in the vastness of the Indonesian archipelago, that there is the only source of 2 spices on the entire globe which were soon to change the course of human history, cause wars, overthrow empires, and transform the map of the world forever. Descending lower, breaking through the layers of feathery clouds, we can see an incredible palette of colors where the burnt, mineral-rich dark brown and in places even black volcanic earth contrasts with the blinding white of coral beaches and the endless depth of the ocean, creating a landscape so perfect and unreal that it seems to be an illusion, a mirage created by hungry and thirsty-minded sailors, a mirage that will disappear as soon as you try to touch it, and yet it is a world that is painfully real, powerful, and preparing for a storm the likes of which it has never seen before.
Delving deeper into the bowels of this tropical utopia, leaving the open spaces of the sky and ocean, we enter the dense, almost impermeable canopy of rainforests, where we are struck by a phenomenon much more powerful than the image itself, the smell. The air on the Banda Islands is not an ordinary transparent gas. It is a thick, breathing syrup, heavy with unimaginably intense, intoxicating, and almost narcotic aromas that settle on the skin, penetrate clothes, and penetrate straight into the bloodstream, putting the senses in a state of permanent intoxication. It is a symphony of scents dominated by the sweet, spicy, slightly peppery scent of nutmeg, intertwined with the sharp notes of cloves growing on neighboring islands, the crisp sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and iodine, and the deep, earthy aroma of volcanic dust and organic matter decaying in the forest floor, which constantly nourishes this crazy biological dance. The play of light in this natural sanctuary is a spectacle in itself, reminiscent of Johannes Vermeer's most sophisticated techniques of chiaroscuro. Single razor-sharp sun rays pierce the multi-layered canopy of leaves, creating golden pillars of light vibrating with dust, which pinpoint illuminate the dark forest floor, bringing out fantastic shapes of flora and fauna from the velvety, tar-like shadows. The ground beneath your feet is soft, supple, and moist, and its color ranges from warm walnut brown to deep, glossy anthracite black, providing the perfect backdrop for the vibrant, saturated greens exploding all around you, from the bright, almost phosphorescent shades of young shoots to the dark, leathery surfaces of adult leaves. This forest is not a quiet place. It teems with constant polyphonic life, the singing of exotic birds with feathers sparkling like precious jewels, the buzzing of insects the size of a human hand, and the sound of the wind rushing between tree trunks, which creates an audiosphere as rich and overwhelming as the palette of smells and colors prevailing here. This sanctuary cut off from the rest of the world, this secret garden protected by treacherous reefs, changing monsoon winds, and vast expanses of ocean, is a unique biosphere in which evolution has put everything on one card, creating an environment perfectly and exclusively adapted to sustain the life of one particular species of tree, which to Westerners was worth more than its weight in pure gold. To understand the obsession that gripped the world at that time, we must focus our attention on the very heart of this biological miracle, approaching with microscopic, almost scientific precision a single specimen of Myristica fragrans, the nutmeg that reaches its absolute, ultimate perfection in this specific microclimate. This close-up shows the harvesting process as an almost sacred act, full of respect and ancient knowledge. We see the hands of a native craftsman from Banda, hands rough, calloused from work, with skin the color of dark mahogany, into which plant juices and volcanic dust have eaten away, as they delicately yet confidently grasp a fruit resembling a slightly larger pale yellow or light orange apricot, the skin of which is smooth and firm, shining in the morning light.
When the fruit reaches full ripeness, it bursts along its natural seam with a quiet but audible crack, revealing its hidden interior in an explosion of color so violent and unexpected that it hits the sense of sight like a physical blow, revealing to our eyes the bright, blood-red, vein-like arrow of thick, fresh blood, known to the world as mace or mossis, which, like intricate organic ribs, tightly it wraps around a dark brown hard shell, inside which lies the ultimate treasure, the nutmeg seed. The contrast between the bright outer pericarp, the bright red arrow, and
the people who inhabit these islands and take care of these priceless groves, the Bandaneans, are not primitive savages, as European colonizers would later like to see them in their false propaganda reports justifying genocide, but a highly organized, proud, and extremely refined society of merchants, sailors, and farmers who have lived for centuries in perfect symbiosis with the surrounding nature. Their physiognomy betrays centuries of intermingling of the blood of the various peoples of the archipelago, and their bodies, agile, muscular, and slender, move with the innate grace of dancers as they climb with incredible dexterity the tall, smooth trunks of nutmeg trees, using special hand-woven baskets on long bamboo poles to reach the highest-growing, most valuable fruits without damaging the delicate branches. Their understanding of the vagaries of volcanic soil, monsoon rain cycles, wind patterns, and moon phases goes beyond mere agricultural knowledge. It is a kind of deep, almost mystical connection to the land from which they were born, an awareness that their survival and well-being depend on maintaining the delicate ecological balance of this fragile system, where one rash action could lead to disaster. Sweat on their skin, glistening in the sun, catches fractions of the light penetrating through the leaves, creating hundreds of tiny luminous reflections that highlight the texture of their traditional clothes in earthy tones, with a touch of bright accents colored with natural pigments from the roots and bark of local trees. For them, nutmeg is not just a barterable commodity, a column of numbers in the ledgers as seen by heartless clerks in distant Amsterdam or Lisbon, but an integral part of their identity, a sacred gift from the gods that has shaped their culture, religion, social structure, and position on the map of the vast sea-connected trading empires of the East, allowing them to maintain their sovereignty and wealth for countless generations. Leaving the shady, cool nutmeg groves and shifting our gaze to the wide, sandy, and sun-drenched shores of the islands, we become witnesses of a scene that clearly proves the global importance of this isolated piece of land long before any white man could draw its outlines on his inaccurate parchment maps. The natural port, protected from destructive storms by volcanic atolls and dense coral reefs, is not an empty, wild corner, but a bustling, multilingual, and multicultural trading center, a cosmopolitan crossroads of worlds where merchants from the most remote corners of Asia and the Middle East meet, creating a fascinating mosaic of colors, sounds, and smells. On the calm, azure waters of the bay, resembling a sheet of scratched glass, sway majestic, heavy, and bulging Arabian boats. Their triangular sailcloths with a rough, thick texture bear the traces of hundreds of storms and the scorching sun of the Indian Ocean, and their dark wooden hulls smell of tar, old cedar wood, and salt. Right next to them, at anchor, are slender, elegant Chinese junks from the Ming Dynasty, with characteristic fan-shaped sails reinforced with bamboo slats, which in the light of the setting sun cast complex geometric shadows on the decks full of priceless goods, and from their interiors come the rhythmic sound of wooden bells and the melodious tone of the Mandarin language. Trade in this port has nothing to do with the brutal exploitation that Europeans would later bring here. It is a highly organized, peaceful, and mutually respectful dance of diplomacy and economics, during which tons of carefully dried nutmeg and maces are weighed with surgical precision on brass scales and exchanged for delicate.
The complexity and sophistication of the Banda Island communities only fully emerges when we take a closer look at their unique, decentralized political structure, which contrasts sharply with the feudal, absolutist monarchies dominating Europe at the same time. We will not find here any powerful king, sultan, or despot ruling with an iron fist from the height of a fortified palace, who could be easily bribed with gold, intimidated by force, or manipulated with false promises, which will later turn out to be the greatest curse and the hardest nut to crack for European trading companies wishing to establish their monopoly here. Instead, the archipelago is a kind of mercantile, oligarchic republic, a network of interconnected but fiercely independent settlements and villages, each governed by its own ancient Ardat laws, creating a complex web of alliances, obligations, and rituals that keep this entire society in perfect, if delicate, balance. The wealth generated by the spice trade is not accumulated in the hands of a single ruler, but is distributed, albeit unevenly, throughout the community, as seen in the solid architecture of their houses, resistant to devastating monsoons and earthquakes, built on huge wooden stilts, decorated with intricate carvings depicting mythical animals and nautical motifs. These are extremely proud people, aware of their own value and the strategic power that the monopoly on the most desirable raw material on the planet gives them. People who for centuries have successfully navigated the turbulent waters of Southeast Asian geopolitics, repelling the attempts of the powerful Javanese empires or Malay sultanates, using not only military force, but above all cunning, diplomacy, and economic power, believing deeply in their inviolability and uniqueness under the protection of ancestral spirits and a silent volcano. The political and spiritual heart of this decentralized society beats in just a few places on the islands, and the most important decisions are made during gatherings under the spreading crowns of ancient Bengal banyan trees, huge banyan trees whose structure is a metaphor for the Banda Island community itself. Let us imagine the scene of such a gathering, bathed in dense cinematic chiaroscuro, where dramatic slanting rays of the sun filter through the thickets of leaves, illuminating only fragments of the faces and hands of the gathered men, while the rest is drowned in a deep, velvety shadow cast by monstrous air roots, twisted like gigantic petrified snakes, falling from the branches and sticking back into the ground, creating natural colonnades and dark, secluded caves. This is where the orang kaya, literally rich people, elders, patriarchs, and the most eminent merchants meet, who, with their authority, age, experience, and accumulated wealth, have gained the right to decide on war, peace, and trade, and their faces, marked with deep wrinkles, resemble the texture of the rough shell of a nutmeg seed, being a living record of decades of sea journeys, commercial negotiations, and life struggles. Dressed in ceremonial, extremely rich robes woven from the softest Indian silk, interwoven with gold thread and dyed in deep saturated shades of burgundy, ochre, burnt sienna, and cool indigo blue, they sit on woven rattan mats, silently and with dignified concentration, chewing betel nut, the red juice of which stains their lips, giving them the appearance of menacing silent deities from ancient mythologies. When they finally speak, their words are weighed as carefully as a precious spice on a port scale, and discussions about tariffs, trade rights for incoming foreigners, defense alliances, and profit sharing are carried out in quiet, gravelly voices.
However, this idyllic, almost utopian vision, this symphony of sense and harmonious trade, carries a hidden flaw, a dark, deep-seated trauma, a reminder of the past that rings like a warning bell in the memory of the elders every time a foreign sail appears on the horizon. The memory of the first Europeans who came to these azure waters in search of fabulous fortunes. It was the beginning of the 16th century, when huge, bulging Portuguese carracks with high stern castles and powerful guns first crossed the smooth surface of the sea around Banda, bringing into this tropical, nutmeg-scented paradise the stench of sweaty bodies, rancid meat, gunpowder, and a fanatical, bloody religiosity that hated compromises.
The collision of these two extremely different worlds resembled the brutal tearing of a silk cloth with a dull, rusty knife. On the one hand, refined, clean merchants from Banda, dressed in light fabrics, and on the other, determined, cruel Iberian explorers, dressed in stuffy leather jackets and heavy steel armor that shone sinisterly like armor in the merciless equatorial sun. Demons from the afterlife, burning their own skin and driving them to the point of madness. The Portuguese, blinded by greed and convinced of their divine civilizing mission, had no intention of negotiating trade terms on an equal basis with people they considered pagans and savages. Their goal was not fair trade, the exchange of goods and knowledge, but the immediate, brutal appropriation of the source of wealth, the establishment of a forceful monopoly, the construction of military fortresses, and the subjugation of rebellious islanders using the naked, terrifying power of fire and steel, as the inhabitants will soon learn they were to learn the hard way about the archipelago. The flashback to these events is a dark, bloody nightmare, a scene of chaos and destruction in which the calm, turquoise port is suddenly filled with the deafening roar of heavy, cast bronze cannons, and thick, black clouds of choking gunpowder smoke obscure the blinding tropical sun, creating a terrifying spectacle of destruction in the raw aesthetics of brutal chiaroscuro, where blinding flashes of gunfire, for a split second, they illuminate the darkness caused by smoke. The Portuguese troops, furious, possessed by loot and Christian zeal, disembark ashore in heavy boats, their boots crushing the delicate corals in the shallows, and their steel rapiers and heavy muskets cutting and piercing everything that stands in their way in the tactics of a classic, brutal plundering raid, intended to inflict such terror that the Orang Kaya will fall to their knees and they renounce their sovereign rights to trade and land. Blood, thick and strikingly bright, stains the snow-white sand of the coral beaches, mixing with salt water and the trampled red avrils of the mace, creating a macabre poem of human greed, in which the red of spices and the red of human life become one terrifying symbol of colonial expansion in the name of profit and the crown. From inside the jungle come the screams of the murdered, the crack of breaking branches, the neighing of terrified horses brought in the bowels of ships, and the crunch of breaking armor. The Portuguese are burning nearby houses, robbing warehouses filled with carefully dried, precious spices, destroying in a few hours the achievements of entire generations, and raping the sacred, previously inviolable sanctuary of the Banda Islands, which seems to herald the final end of this paradise utopian world of independent merchants.
However, the Bandanese, despite the initial shock caused by the unprecedented brutality and firepower of previously unknown firearms, contrary to the calculations of the Portuguese captains, turned out to be by no means passive, helpless victims destined for slaughter or slavery, which soon led to an unexpected and dramatic reversal of roles on this bloody tropical scene. Being people of the sea and jungle, extremely agile, excellent warriors raised in the rigorous culture of the archipelago, they used their intimate, perfect knowledge of their own territory, treacherous sea currents, coral reefs hidden in shallow waters that destroyed the deep hulls of European ships, and the dense, labyrinthine structure of volcanic mountains to launch a crushing, murderous counterattack. In their fast, light, and extremely maneuverable Cora boats, resembling great aquatic predators, they struck with incredible speed from the cover of mangroves and coves, showering the heavy, clumsy, and with no room to maneuver in the narrow straits Portuguese ships with a shower of flaming arrows, poison spears, and stones, and then disappeared like ghosts into the cover of the jungle before the enemy could even reload their cumbersome, slow muskets and guns. Exhausted by the heat, plagued plagued by tropical diseases and confused by the guerrilla tactics of the natives that hit them from all sides like a swarm of angry wasps, the Portuguese suffered increasing losses. Their shiny armor rusted in the incapacitating humidity, and their wounds festered mercilessly, finally forcing the proud hidalgos into a humiliating retreat, abandoning their dreams of military conquest and establishing a physical monopoly, leaving behind piles of corpses and burning ashes that would forever be etched in the collective memory of the archipelago as a dark warning. When the thick, acrid smoke from the Portuguese guns subsided and the mighty galleons with red crosses on their sails disappeared over the horizon, swallowed up by the vastness of the ocean, an illusory peace permeated with the smell of rotting blood and burning wood once again reigned on the Banda Islands, which over time turned into a disastrous sense of false security and unjustified arrogance on the part of the islanders. As the Orankaya elders gathered again under the shady branches of the banyan trees to assess the losses and plan the rebuilding of their villages, they felt proud of their victory, reinforced in the belief that their islands were indeed an impregnable fortress, protected not only by the reef and volcano, but above all by the bravery and determination of their own sons, who defeated the terrifying, ironclad monsters that came from beyond the edge of the world. The Portuguese, unable to maintain a military hold on the archipelago, were eventually forced to assume the humiliating role of ordinary rank-and-file traders, arriving only sporadically and paying the exorbitant prices imposed by the Bandanese in hard coin, which ultimately strengthened the position of the Orankaya and allowed them to believe the most dangerous lie of all, that they had achieved the final triumph and that all Europeans were merely aggressive, primitive, and disorganized adventurers who can easily be repelled by force or forced into economic obedience. Life on the islands returned to its ancient hypnotic rhythm determined by the cycles of the nutmeg harvest. The spice once again filled the warehouses, the port once again filled with dhows and junks, and the wounds inflicted by the Iberian invaders were overgrown with lush tropical vegetation, hiding the burnt trunks and destroyed stone walls. But this idyll was only a fragile, transparent illusion, a peace before a storm that was to come from a completely different, unexpected, and merciless direction, turning their previous understanding of the world into dust and ash.
While the inhabitants of Banda slept peacefully under the endless, starry equatorial sky, and the water in their azure bay glowed with the ghostly, bluish glow of bioluminescent plankton, reminiscent of otherworldly phenomena, exactly on the other side of the globe, in the dark, smoky, humid, and piercingly cold exchange offices and offices of Amsterdam merchants and bankers, a completely new, previously unknown species of predator. It is a dramatic irony of almost Shakespearean proportions. The organic power of the Orankaya of the Banda Islands, based on tradition, nature, and consensus, was completely unaware of the fact that in the swampy, bleak areas of northern Europe, thousands of nautical miles away, a cold, soulless, calculating, and infinitely powerful bureaucratic military machine was being created in pain, whose sole, absolute goal was to completely devour their tropical paradise. It was no longer a state striving to increase the glory of its gods anointed, nor religious fanatics eager to baptize pagans with sword and fire, like the Portuguese or the Spanish. It was something much worse, a creation devoid of conscience, a human face, or moral inhibitions, a corporation, a nameless legal entity whose soul was woven entirely of paper, ink, ruthless calculations, and an insatiable, paralyzing lust for gigantic dividends. The Dutch East India Company, known to the world under the soon-to-be blood-chilling acronym VOC, was building its power based on innovative, revolutionary mechanisms of financial markets, stock exchanges, and shares, and its shareholders, from wealthy townspeople to widows and orphans, contributed to financing the construction of powerful, ultra-modern war and trade fleets, assuming in advance that this investment would only pay off with a gigantic profit, and only on one non-negotiable condition, obtaining an absolute, total, and ruthless monopoly on the spice trade. The nature of this approaching enemy was drastically different from anything the proud and free sailors, merchants, and warriors of the Banda Islands had ever faced in their long history, making their defensive strategy doomed to terrible failure, though they did not yet know it. The sinister Hiran 17, or 17 Lords, managing directors of the VOC from their luxurious and cool offices in the Republic of the United Provinces, were nothing like honorable warriors or local chieftains with whom to make beneficial alliances, exchange hostages, arrange non-aggression pacts, or negotiate on the basis of common human values. For these Calvinist merchants dressed in austere black costumes, the island of Banda did not worry a beautiful wonder of nature, a symphony of sense, or an ancient society deserving of any respect or recognition. In their terrifyingly analytical and cold minds, this tropical archipelago was just a black, hard string of numbers in the accounting books, a strategic point on the logistical map of the empire, an error in the system, a market anomaly that had to be remedied decisively and brutally at the lowest possible cost through the complete 100% mechanized elimination of any local competition and free trade, which, after all, was the foundation of the entire existence of the Bondanians. The Dutch did not just want a share of the profits or favorable trade discounts, as the self-satisfied islanders initially assumed. Their cold, calculating, and methodical, even mathematical greed dictated to destroy the very essence of the independence of the Banda Islands, reduce its inhabitants to the role of slave laborers, or, if this proved impossible, simply murder the entire population, regardless of any moral costs, just to keep the global price of nutmeg at desired level in European ports.
Returning our gaze from the cold, calculating Dutch offices back to the tropically sun-drenched shores of Banda, a careful observer will already notice the first, extremely subtle but clearly ominous harbingers of coming changes, as if the very nature of this extraordinary place sensed the absolute and irreversible end of its innocence approaching from a distance. The monsoon wind seems to change its direction, predictable for centuries, bringing with it not only the promised rains, but also a disturbing cold, and on the distant horizon, blurred in the hot air, appear the silhouettes of alien multi-masted ships with square, austere, and disturbingly dark sails, whose silhouettes resemble neither agile Arab dhows nor wide Chinese junks, but heavy, packed steel and bronze fortresses on the water. The sun, bathed, seems to lose its golden warm color, known from the canvases of the Golden Age, and the chiaroscuro effect deepens rapidly, almost dramatically. The velvety velvet shadows cast by the ancient jungle become longer, more dense, tarry and penetrating, slowly absorbing the bright sunlight, like a harbinger of an approaching eclipse that is to last forever and cover the entire island with an impenetrable, terrifying darkness. The people of Banda look out to sea with increasing anxiety, instinctively sensing that although the ocean around them seems as calm, turquoise, and beautiful as ever, with each passing day, with each crash of the waves on the coral reefs, a force is drawing closer to them, whose brutal logic, murderous efficiency, and inhuman corporate organization defy their traditional understanding of the world, diplomacy, and war. The perfect, harmonious, and isolated world of the Banda Islands, this natural sanctuary, a secret garden full of intoxicating scents and birds of paradise, is at this historical moment only a priceless, extremely fragile, and intricately made glass decoration placed by an unaware child on a powerful steel anvil, over which the merciless 100-ton hammer of progress, capitalism, and European domination will soon fall.
This terrifying vision makes us realize that the inevitability of this catastrophe lies in the very physics of human greed, which, organized into a corporate machine destroying everything in its path, will not rest until the Paradise Islands are left with only blood, tears, and ash mixed with volcanic sand, constituting the foundation for a ruthless global monopoly, the likes of which the world has never seen before. To sum up this extraordinary, almost lyrical, and at the same time terrifying portrait of the most precious place on earth just before its spectacular and tragic collapse, we are left with a forever memorable, iconic, and charged with sinister symbolism image from the depths of the jungle, where time seems to completely stop for a moment, dying in breath before the approaching hurricane. A lone nutmeg seed rests peacefully in the calloused, wrinkled, and open hand of an aged Orankaya elder. This inconspicuous, dark brown, grooved, thumb-sized nut looks in this light like a rare gem, a biological marvel, a work of nature's art, the fruit of hard work, and a source of unimaginable ancient wealth for an entire island community. However, from the perspective of inexorable history, this small seed in his hand already appears as the final dark curse, the seed of cataclysm, the reason why powerful, armed-to-the-teeth armadas of murderous ships are currently crossing angry, endless oceans, preparing to drop a hail of lead and fire on innocent people. This slowly growing, unstoppable, even claustrophobic transition from the absolute, breathtaking beauty, delight, and deep peace of a paradise utopia to paralyzing, blood-curdling fear and an inevitable sense of impending doom is complete. Left. Chapter 3. A Corporation of Kings. At the height of its golden age, the Netherlands was unlike any other place on Earth, becoming the pulsating heart of global trade, where every second was measured in the jingle of gold guilders and the rustle of precious silks. The heavy, salty fog from the North Sea rolled lazily over the cobblestone streets and the oily, dark waters of the canals, choking the city in a cold, damp embrace that could not quench the burning fever of absolute profit within its inhabitants. In this puritanical, austere culture, where ostentatious displays of emotion were almost a sin, unimaginable wealth became a silent but powerful proof of divine favor, and a cold Calvinistic work ethic transformed greed into the sacred, paramount duty of every self-respecting citizen. The air was extremely thick with the smell of burning peat, damp, rotting wood, fish dried in the frosty wind, and exotic spicy roots that slowly began to leak into Europe, irritating the palates and igniting the imagination of the powerful of this world. The city's architecture, with its slender, exorbitantly expensive red brick tenement houses, topped with intricately carved gables, seemed to stretch its arms desperately towards the leaden sky, as if the buildings themselves were praying for more riches, more ships, more monopoly on the unknown and dangerous. In the deep, tarry shadows of narrow alleys, where light rarely penetrated, poverty still sharpened its dirty fangs, but in the bright, spacious windows of merchant houses reflected the glow of an incredible fortune built on cold calculation, murderous risk, and ruthless, bloody competition for every fraction of the market. Light and deep shadow, creating a drama worthy of Rembrandt's best canvases, took place every day on the streets of this noisy city, where the dark velvet shadows of the alleys contrasted brutally with the sharp, directional light of street lamps and the sun breaking through the blue clouds, illuminating the stern faces of men who would soon change the course of the history of the entire planet. It was in this dense air, saturated with predatory ambition, that a monstrous idea was born that was to overshadow absolutely everything that had so far been known in the history of human trade. The idea of creating an entity so powerful that its icy shadow would soon fall on distant oceans and continents, suppressing all resistance and monopolizing what was most valuable on the furthest eastern frontiers of the known world. The action moves to The Hague, to the monumental Binnenhof complex, where in the huge, great hall of the States General, the fate of not only one country, but the entire globe, unaware of the approaching storm, was being weighed. The interior of this political temple was cavernous, dripping with heavy carved oak wood, the dark grain of which seemed to absorb every sound and every ray of light, creating an atmosphere of oppressive, claustrophobic solemnity and menace. The huge Flanders tapestries hanging on the walls, depicting biblical and historical scenes of triumph, muffled the footsteps of the dignitaries gathered there, giving the whole scene a dreamlike, almost ghostly quality, while the air in the hall was almost blue with thick, acrid tobacco smoke coming from dozens of long clay pipes smoked by the gathered notables. Light and deep shadow, creating a drama worthy of Rembrandt's best canvases, took place every day on the streets of this noisy city, where the dark velvet shadows of the alleys contrasted brutally with the sharp, directional light of street lamps and the sun breaking through the blue clouds, illuminating the stern faces of men who would soon change the course of the history of the entire planet. It was in this dense air, saturated with predatory ambition, that a monstrous idea was born that was to overshadow absolutely everything that had so far been known in the history of human trade. The idea of creating an entity so powerful that its icy shadow would soon fall on distant oceans and continents, suppressing all resistance and monopolizing what was most valuable on the furthest eastern frontiers of the known world.
In the very center of this gathering, illuminated by the brightest ray of light streaming through the stained glass window, lay it, the official charter of the VOC, a document that was a physical manifestation of unimaginable pride and audacity, written in thick black ink on the most expensive thick calf parchment, the rough texture of which was felt even at a distance. The creaking of goose quills on parchment sounded in the silence of the hall like the clashing of swords being drawn from their scabbards as calligraphers carefully inscribed individual terrifying articles, clauses and laws that transferred into the hands of private shareholders power previously reserved only for anointed kings and emperors. This charter did not speak of free trade or diplomacy. It was a legal manifesto of conquest that gave the Lords of the 17 unlimited rights to build fortified fortresses, maintain their own powerful armies, recruit mercenaries, build private war fleets, mint their own coins, and declare wars and conclude peace treaties on behalf of the Republic of the United Provinces, completely without having to ask the government for permission. Reading these words written in a Gothic sharp typeface, one could get the impression that this was not an act of establishing a joint stock company, but a contract under which the Netherlands sold its soul in exchange for an absolute monopoly on the spice market, accepting in advance every bloodshed, every plunder, and every act of genocide that would prove necessary to achieve the goal. The physical act of signing this document by top government officials was slow, almost ritualistic, and each signature seemed to be another nail in the coffin of trade freedom in the Indian Ocean, sealing the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives that would soon collide with the ruthless VOC machine. The sight of that parchment, gleaming in the dim light, surrounded by men in black, was the embodiment of a terrifying new era, the era of corporate imperialism, in which the state became merely a silent, obsequious instrument in the hands of big capital, and human rights and the sovereignty of foreign nations ceased to matter in the face of the promise of 1,000-fold returns on investment.
The climax of the deliberations came when the time came for the final sealing of the document, which, in this oppressive chiaroscuro-based setting, took on the dimension of a dark, almost magical ritual, when a servant carried in a heavy silver bowl with burning candles, whose hot glow cast new dancing shadows on the stern faces of the lords of the 17. A thick stick of the highest quality, carmine Spanish wax was carefully held against the hissing flame of the candle, and the high heat rapidly began to melt the hard matter, which slowly and viscously began to drip onto the lower part of the parchment, looking in the flickering light exactly like heavy, thick drops of coagulating human blood. The smell of melting wax, pungent, resinous, and slightly suffocating, immediately mixed with the acrid smell of tobacco, creating an olfactory mixture that would forever remind the men present there of the day they became masters of the world, and each falling drop of wax seemed to count the time until the great invasion began. A massive, heavy brass stamp, engraved with the official coat of arms and the first outlines of a seal, was pressed with great force and precision into the hot red puddle on the parchment, and the dull, loud clatter of the metal on the oak table echoed throughout the great hall, interrupting for a moment the gasping of those gathered and the ticking of the large standing clock. As the stamp was slowly lifted and the wax began to immediately harden, a deeply imprinted, intact seal was revealed that was the ultimate proof of the birth of a monster, a seal that gave legal validity to murder, pillage, and enslavement in the name of the majesty of the Republic and the infinite glory of corporate profit.
A closer look at the anatomy of the finished East Indiaman revealed its true, terrifying nature, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was by no means an innocent merchant ship, but a powerful floating war machine, camouflaged under the guise of a trading mission in search of rare spices. Its bulging, exceptionally wide hull was designed to accommodate astronomical amounts of precious cargo on the return voyage, but its sides, several layers thick of the hardest oak, were deliberately reinforced in a way that allowed them to withstand direct hits from heavy cannonballs from enemy ships or coastal batteries. Along the sides, threateningly and ominously, heavy iron-tied embrasures, the so-called gun gates, were opening, looking from a distance like the blind, lidless eyes of a beast, from which rows of heavy, deadly bronze cannons would soon emerge, capable of reducing any native village or competing caravel to rubble. These enormous vessels, gleaming dully in the sparse rays of sunlight, were being pulled into the dark interior of the ship by powerful pulley systems, their terrible weight causing the entire wooden structure to creak and groan, as if in protest against the murderous fate to which it had been forced by its creators. The decks, scrubbed white with sand, were constructed to resist boarding and mass slaughter at short range, equipped with heavy protective nets and emplacements for gunners armed with muskets, ready to pour lead into anyone who dared to threaten company property, which was valued infinitely more than any human life. A masterpiece of engineering and an instrument of absolute terror, this ship made clear to anyone who looked at it that the coming monopoly of the nutmeg and clove trade would not be negotiated through treaties and polite bows, but would be enforced through ruthless violence, jets of fire, and merciless barrages. In the shadow of these colossal hulks, smelling of fresh resin, in front of the company's small recruiting offices, huge, loud, and desperate crowds gathered every day, constituting a pulsating human mass that was to become cannon fodder and labor for the great corporate machine being thrown to the other side of the globe. There were men from every corner of Europe, ruined by debt, traders in worn-out, once expensive velvets, petty thieves and murderers fleeing the executioner's axe, landless, naive provincial peasants dreaming of mountains of gold, and experienced, scarred mercenaries looking for a new war in which to draw blood.
The falling dusk and the harsh, flickering light of the coals burning in the iron braziers cast sharp shadows on their tired, dirty faces, reminiscent of the chiaroscuro in the paintings of Georges de la Tour, highlighting the deep lines of fear, desperation, hunger, and naive ambition that fought for primacy in their glances towards the port offices. The conversation in the crowd was filled with feverish whispered tales of the untold riches of the Spice Islands, of palaces of gold and women as docile as silk, tales carefully stoked by company agents to drown out the grim statistics that only a fraction of those who leave ever return alive, and the rest die of scurvy, malaria, or in bloody skirmishes with the natives and the Spanish. Despite the paralyzing subcutaneous fear of the unknown ocean, where the water rotted in barrels and people's bodies were devoured by exotic diseases and vermin, the hunger and abject poverty present on the streets of Europe were much more terrifying and real, which drove thousands of these lost people straight into the open predatory arms of the East India Company, offering a one-time ticket to hell or an unimaginable paradise.
After weeks of intense, almost slave-like work, the Great Armada, bringing together the most powerful units of the company, left the canals at Amsterdam and gathered at the roadstead of Texel Island, which was the main rallying point and the last haven before the open, endless, and brutal ocean. And the sight was breathtaking, paralyzing every witness with its enormity. The gray, angry, and turbid waters of the North Sea, tossed by powerful gales and covered with white manes of foaming waves, crashed furiously against the massive, bulging hulls of the anchored ships, which rocked heavily and with dignity, like a herd of gigantic, lumbering whales resting on the surface, ready for a mortal fight. The icy wind howled and whistled between the complex geometric tangle of thick rigging ropes and the exposed masts several dozen meters high, and thousands of square meters of canvas sails, although still reefed, fluttered with a dull, disturbing thunder, intensifying the aura of ominous tension and waiting for the moment of breaking from the chains. The fleet assembled in the roadstead, consisting of a dozen powerful three-masted ships, smaller patrol yachts, and supply ships, was a monumental sight, an absolute and undeniable triumph of human engineering and determination, a firepower superior to the fleets of many sovereign European states, assembled for the sole purpose of securing the gigantic profits from the spice trade. The sailors and soldiers crowding the open, frozen decks, wrapped in soaked woolen coats, gazed toward the gray, fog-shrouded horizon with a mixture of blind excitement, blood-curdling terror, and ultimate resignation, knowing that for so many of them, those icy waters around Texel were the last image of the old world they would ever see before a long and painful death in the tropics. The atmosphere before departure was electrified. Every creak of the tensioned rope, every creak of the anchor chain, and every order shouted by the officers through the loudspeakers intensified the feeling that the great spring of history was just being stretched to the limit, and that the impact that would follow when it was released would forever shatter the existing political and economic order in the eastern seas. When the captains and navigators finally confirmed the favorable meteorological phenomena and the favorable direction of the eastern winds, the order was given to unfurl the main sails, and on the descending gigantic swaths of heavy, raw canvas, a powerful symbol painted with tar and paint appeared to the world, causing a shiver of horror in everyone who realized its meaning. It was a large, exquisitely woven monogram, in which the huge, dominant letter V, symbolizing the word Verenigde, was inscribed with smaller letters O and C, creating a geometric trademark that was soon to become the most recognizable and at the same time the most hated symbol on the entire coast of Asia and Africa, a harbinger of exploitation and conquest.
This logo was much more than just a craft mark on bales of material. It was a symbol of a new, absolute secular religion, a banner of ruthless corporate capitalism, under which there was no room for the old chivalrous ideas, compassion or pity, but only for a hard mathematical calculation of profits in terms of annual dividend settlements. The sight of this monstrous sign, standing out starkly against the background of wind-taut sails and stormy leaden clouds, had a devastating psychological impact both on the ship's crews, making them fully aware of who their lives and souls now belonged to, and on all outside observers who felt that before them was the embodiment of a new supranational power beyond any human control. The VOC logo fluttering on the tops of the masts of dozens of ships seemed to burn with its own sinister, invisible fire.
Chapter 4. The English Thorn.
The Banda Sea, dark and treacherous as the abyss, stretched beneath a sky heavy with leaden clouds as the small English ship, scarred by countless storms, slowly made its way through the stormy waves, heading for the heart of the most precious archipelago on the planet. The Dutch East India Company, the powerful and ruthless VOC, was not the only force seeking absolute control of the spicy wealth of the East, and this battered, struggling ship was a harbinger of the challenge to come. Unlike the powerful state-backed Dutch galleons, which resembled floating fortresses packed with cannons and soldiers, the English East India Company, known as the EIC, operated on a completely different basis, being a much smaller, poorer organization, but therefore much more determined, opportunistic, and willing to take deadly risks. On the deck of this ship, its oak planking creaking ominously with each wave, stood Captain Nathaniel Courthope, a man with a sunburnt face and eyes of unyielding ambition, aware that he was entering enemy territory where profit was measured in ounces of nutmeg and failure was paid in blood. His ship, with its sails torn by tropical winds and its crew depleted by scurvy and dysentery, looked pathetic compared to the majestic Dutch vessels, but this inconspicuousness was its greatest asset, allowing it to slip unnoticed through the dense network of naval patrols that the VOC had stationed around the islands to guard their monopoly like an eye in the eye. Courthope knew that he was no match for the Dutch in open combat, so his weapons were not cannons, but diplomacy, cunning, and the promise of an alternative to the ruthless oppression that the Republic of the United Provinces had imposed on the indigenous inhabitants of the archipelago. The Englishman saw cracks in the Dutch terror machine, understanding that a monopoly maintained solely through fear and brute force was inherently fragile and prone to rebellion, and he intended to fuel that rebellion by offering the Bandaneans a deal that in their eyes could be considered the lesser of two evils. As he approached the islands, he felt the thick, intoxicating scent of spices in the air, the scent of wealth that had driven European monarchs to madness and was now about to become the seed of a conflict that would shake the foundations of modern trade and change the map of the world forever. The volcanic cones of the Banda Islands looming on the horizon were not just a destination for Courthope, they were an altar on which he intended to challenge the Dutch hegemony, using every means at his disposal, every weakness of the enemy, and every resentment that the natives had towards their oppressors. With each mile-long distance covered, the English captain became convinced that in this uneven game, where the stake was domination of the global market, even the smallest thorn, if stuck in the right place, could cause gangrene and bring down the largest giant to its knees. Courthope and his EIC company, although operating on a much smaller budget and without a powerful navy at their side, had something that the arrogant VOC lacked: flexibility and a willingness to listen to the other side, which in the brutal realities of early colonialism made them almost visionaries, willing to risk everything for one lucrative deal. In their eyes, the Dutch had made a fundamental mistake. Instead of trading with the native inhabitants, they decided to enslave them, and this opened the door for the English, who decided to slip into this gap of resentment, assuming the mask of liberators and righteous business partners.
The arrival of the English ship on the shores of the Banda Islands was not a coincidence, but a precisely planned operation aimed at the heart of the Dutch monopoly, and Captain Courthope was perfectly aware.
The culmination of these exhaustive talks, a moment of historic significance, was the drafting of an official treaty written on rough yellowed parchment with ink that had to withstand the humidity of the tropical climate. This treaty, although in the eyes of the lawyers from Amsterdam would only be a worthless piece of paper, had the importance of life and death for both parties present in the cottage. It transferred to the English crown, in the hands of King James I, the smallest of the islands of the archipelago, a speck of land called Run. The act of signing was thoroughly symbolic and took place in an aura of almost religious anointment in the light of flickering torches, casting deep restless shadows on the walls, reminiscent of the images of great chiaroscuro masters. One of the oldest Orang Kaya leaders placed his sign on the document with a trembling, wrinkled hand. This simple gesture, the touch of an ink-soaked finger, instantly transformed a tiny, forgotten island into a territory of global importance, driving a sharp, poisonous thorn into the very center of the Dutch's carefully woven trade empire. Giving up the island of Run was not an act of capitulation to the English, but a sophisticated move on the political chessboard, a desperate attempt to draw two European powers into a conflict that, in the intention of the Bandaneans, would lead to the mutual bleeding of their captors and ensure the salvation of the rest of the archipelago. Run Island, although only the size of a rock sticking out of the ocean, had invaluable nutmeg forests, and its strategic location made it an ideal base and observation point from which the English could effectively harass Dutch convoys and break the rules of monopoly. From the moment the ink dried on the parchment, the tiny island was no longer just a patch of jungle, but became a powerful symbol of English disobedience, bandana resistance, and the coming inevitable war between the most powerful corporations in the world at that time. News of this brazen alliance, carried by Dutch spies and terrified merchants, quickly reached the ears of the VOC admiral, causing a shock to the local headquarters comparable only to the eruption of the nearby Gunung Api volcano. In a lavishly appointed office filled with looted goods from the east, heavy oak furniture imported from Europe, and maps demarcating the Dutch spheres of influence, the commander's face contorted into a grimace of unbridled rage as the messenger delivered him the report of the English presence on the Run. The admiral, whose power was based on fear and total control, slammed his clenched fist on the table with such force that the wine from the crystal goblet spilled, resembling a pool of fresh blood. For him, the presence of even a single English ship in the archipelago was tantamount to an existential threat to the entire economic structure of the Republic. He understood perfectly what Heron 17, the company managers in Amsterdam, knew. The monopoly is absolute or does not exist at all, and the slightest break in the control system will lead to a decline in prices on European markets and ultimately destroy the profits on which the power of the Netherlands was built. The Isle of Run may have been small, isolated, and seemingly insignificant to the layman, but from the Dutch admiral's point of view it was like a festering wound on the flesh of his empire. And the betrayal of the Bandaneans who dared to seek outside protection had to be punished with maximum showy brutality. Orders were immediately issued to mobilize the fleet, heavy guns were pulled from arsenals, additional gunpowder rations were issued to soldiers, and shipyards worked around the clock to prepare ships for a punitive expedition whose sole purpose was to raze the island of Run to the ground and slaughter all who dared to oppose the will of the VOC. The Dutch were willing to risk open diplomatic conflict with England, recognizing property rights dictated by cannon barrels and enforced by industry.
Chapter 5. First Treaties. First Blood. The air over the island of Naira was thick, humid, and choking, saturated with the sickly, sweet smell of rotting seaweed, sea salt, and the omnipresent, intoxicating smell of nutmeg, which was the only source of wealth in this archipelago cursed by God and men. From the deck of the flagship of the Dutch East India Company, a massive galleon with dark, sooty sides that dropped anchor with a mighty crash in the azure waters of the bay, Admiral Peter Willems Verhoef looked out at the green shore with a mixture of cold calculation and growing, uncontrollable irritation. The sun at its zenith poured down from a merciless heat-bleached sky, reflecting in a blinding white light off the brass gun barrels and steel morions of the Dutch soldiers, who were sweating profusely under thick layers of woolen uniforms and leather jackets completely unsuited to the tropical hell. Verhoef, a veteran of countless skirmishes and a man of iron, indomitable will, came here with one clear order from the powerful Heeren 17, the Lords of the 17, residing in the distant fog-shrouded Amsterdam, to secure an absolute, undivided, and ruthless monopoly on the spice trade, no matter the cost, no matter the resistance, using diplomacy if possible, and brute military force if necessary. His fleet, an imposing armada of a dozen heavily armed vessels, cast long, ominous shadows across the calm waters, a physical manifestation of the imperial ambitions of a nascent sea power that would tolerate no competition or opposition from what they considered primitive local communities. The treaty signing ceremony was organized on the wide sandy beach of the island of Naira, where two fundamentally different worlds, two incompatible visions of reality, law, and the universe collided. Arranged in stiff, perfectly aligned ranks, the Dutch looked like a war machine straight from European battlefields, their muskets resting on their shoulders at a perfect angle, their pikes pointing at the sky like a forest of steel, and their drums beating a steady, menacing rhythm that was intended to strike fear and obedience in the hearts of the islanders. Opposite them, in stark contrast, stood the Orang Kaya, the elders of the Banda, dressed in rich hand-woven silks and intricately dyed batiks, whose deep saturated colors, ruby reds, emerald greens, and off-ochre, shimmered in the merciless light of the tropical sun. Their faces, scarred with deep wrinkles from years spent at sea and in the councils, remained impenetrable, as if carved from dark, hard mahogany, betraying no trace of fear of the military might of visitors from the other side of the world. Between these two groups, on a makeshift table covered with velvet, lay a thick, stiff parchment covered with dense calligraphic writing, a document that in the eyes of the Dutch constituted an inviolable legal contract, and in the eyes of the Bandaneses was only an incomprehensible abstract set of signs imposed on them under the threat of muskets and cannons. The very moment of signing was a tense farce, laced with deep, fundamental misunderstanding and a hidden threat of violence that hung in the thick air like a storm cloud. The Dutch translator, his forehead beaded with perspiration, cracked his voice as he translated the complex legal intricacies of the Amsterdam notaries into the local Malay dialect, trying to explain the concept of commercial exclusivity and absolute monopoly, which was as foreign to the islanders as snow. For the Orang Kaya, the sea was a free entity, open to all whom the winds brought to its shores. Trade was a divine right, a centuries-long cycle of exchange in which Arabs, Chinese, Javanese, and now the English had an equal right to participate in exchange for silver, steel, and fine fabrics.
Chapter 6. The Butcher of the Gang Arrives.
The Dutch Golden Age was an era of absolute contrasts, a time when unimaginable wealth born from the global spice trade flowed in a rushing river of gold to Amsterdam, a city built on marshy mud, wooden stilts, and ruthless, endless ambition. On a dark, bitterly cold and rainy morning, with leaden clouds hanging low over the roiling black waters of the Herengracht Canal, an assembly gathered inside the massive stone building of the Oost-Indisch House that would decide the final fate of tens of thousands of lives on the other side of the world. They were Heeren 17, 17 gentlemen, the highest directors of the Dutch East India Company, the most powerful and richest corporation the world had ever seen at that time. The meeting room was in deep, almost tangible darkness, illuminated only by the crackling fire in the huge fireplace and thick wax candles set in heavy brass candelabra. Their quivering light shone across the rich oak paneling, thick tapestries depicting biblical scenes woven in Flanders, and portraits of strict Calvinist merchants with ascetic features. The heavy air was filled with the suffocating smell of wet wool, expensive tobacco imported from colonies in the New World, melted beeswax, and old parchment paper soaked in sea salt. The men seated around the giant oak table were dressed in heavy black velvet, their necks wrapped in stiff, dazzling white ruffs that looked like millstones, symbolizing their status and seriousness. Their faces, immortalized at that moment as if on Rembrandt's dark canvases, expressed a cold, almost inhuman calculation, devoid of any emotional fluctuations. These were the architects of the emerging global capitalism, people for whom vast oceans were only logistical transport routes and distant exotic nations were only items on the ledger, resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. On this particular day, however, they did not gather to routinely discuss annual dividends, profit sharing, or new shipyards, but to hear news that brutally shook the very foundations of their ruthless corporate empire. The broken wax seal with the VOC logo on the crumpled letter lying in the middle of the table looked like a clotted pool of dark blood in the candlelight. The secretary of the assembly, a man with shaking hands and a pale face, had just finished reading the report on the dramatic death of Admiral Verhoef, who was trapped and brutally murdered along with his men on the island of Banda Islands. The words describing the ambush in the humid jungle, the massacred bodies of company officers, and the insolence of the natives who dared to raise a hand against the representatives of the all-powerful VOC hung in the death, almost suffocating silence of the meeting room. However, the director's reaction was not one of human grief, sympathy for the families of the fallen, or even horror at the barbarity described in the report. There was nothing but icy, absolute fury in their eyes, anger at the fact that some uneducated islanders at the end of the world had dared to ignore the contracts they had signed, threatening the company's financial liquidity and the stability of nutmeg prices on the Amsterdam and London stock exchanges. This act of rebellion was seen not as a military tragedy, but as a fundamental affront to the majesty of capital and the inviolability of profit. In that split second, with the flickering candlelight casting long, terrible shadows on the walls, there was a silent, unanimous decision to abandon any illusion of a diplomatic solution. Heeren 17, in their unwavering Calvinist belief in predestination and the divine right to increase wealth, decided that the time of negotiations had passed forever and the Bandanese had lost the right to exist as an independent entity. It was decided to implement the final.
Chapter 7. The Red Fleet Descends.
Before the first sails appeared on the horizon, the Banda Sea seemed to breathe an unnatural, heavy calm. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet, spicy scent of nutmeg that had been both a curse and a blessing on the island of Lontor for centuries. On a high cliff, in the shade of spreading palm trees, stood a young scout named Jaya. His dark, sweat-drenched skin gleamed in the pale morning light. He was rubbing his eyes, struggling with the salt and fatigue from the all-night watch, when suddenly, on the line separating the deep blue sky from the still water, he saw something that froze the blood in his veins. The silhouettes of ships began to emerge from the thick morning fog, like ghostly apparitions from one's worst nightmares. These were not the one or two merchant sailing ships that the Bandaneans were accustomed to seeing. It was a whole forest of dark masts, piercing the sky like spears of vengeful gods.
Jan Peterson Koons's Red Fleet has arrived. More than a dozen massive warships, heavy galleons with high sides and bulging hulls, flanked by smaller transport craft, moved with ruthless mechanical precision towards the defenseless coast. Their sails, made of raw, rough canvas, billowed in the wind, and the first rays of the rising sun were reflected in the windows of the stern cabins, creating an ominous chiaroscuro. The enormity of this armada was astonishing, absolutely apocalyptic. Jaya stood paralyzed, his heart pounding against his ribs with the force of a hammer. He realized that the world he knew, the world of the smell of spices and the songs of his ancestors, was coming to its brutal end. In the valleys, between plantations of precious trees, the joyful noise of the morning was quickly replaced by screams of terror and frantic, desperate mobilization. The news of the approaching fleet spread across the island like a fire burning through the dry savanna. Men, women, and even older children grabbed anything that could be used to defend themselves. Villages, previously peaceful and sleeping in the shadow of the volcano, turned into makeshift military camps. The faces of the Banda Islands were a vivid picture of anguish, mingling primal fear with fierce, angry determination. Traditional stone ramparts, called kakilima, were hastily reinforced with palm trunks and thick coils of lianas. Craftsmen with rough, sweaty hands sharpened bamboo spears over file pits, charring their points to give them the hardness of steel. Others rubbed deadly poisons into the crisp blades in profound silence, asking the jungle spirits for the grace to strike accurately. The air was filled with the smell of burning wood, wet earth, and human sweat. Mothers hid their youngest children in the deepest caves with terror in their eyes, whispering prayers to the old gods, while fathers painted their faces with war paint, preparing for the final battle. Every gesture, every movement was marked by the shadow of impending death, and the rough texture of the stones and the smoothness of the bamboo under their fingers reminded them of the physical reality of their desperate situation. A very different mood prevailed on board the Dutch East India Company's flagship, the mighty galleon Mauritius. There was no room for panic or spiritual exaltation here. There was only cold, calculated calculation and overwhelming technological superiority. The company's men, dressed in thick, ratting ochre wool jackets and heavy steel cuirasses, stood silently on the deck, checking their muskets with pedantic precision. One of them, a veteran named Hendrik, whose face was scarred and covered with the grime of war, poured black powder onto the bearing with a practiced, almost machine-like precision. He softened the glare of the sun on his steel armor by cleaning it with a piece of tarry cloth. There was a sharp, suffocating smell of sulfur, tar, and salty sea around him. The morning chiaroscuro fell on their faces, highlighting deep wrinkles, dispassionate glances, and ruthless.
Chapter 8. The Judgment of Lontor. The conquest of Lontor was over, but the air still trembled with the dull echo of musket shots and the terrible cries of the wounded that carried through the tropical thickets like a damning wail. The Dutch East India Company, that insatiable leviathan of global trade, was now closing its iron, merciless jaws on the Banda archipelago, crushing all resistance with mechanical precision. The sky over the island, reminiscent of the darkest, most saturated brown and dirty yellow canvases of the masters of the Dutch Golden Age, was choking with thick, tarry smoke rising above dozens of burning settlements. The smell of burnt earth, smoldering wood and thatch, mixed with the iron, nauseating smell of fresh blood, and the sweet, almost hypnotic aroma of crushed nutmeg, creating a macabre, suffocating perfume of final death in the air. The company's soldiers, whose tired, stiff faces were covered with a thick, greasy residue of sweat, dried mud, and black powder, resembled ghosts emerging straight from the deepest, velvety shadows. their heavy armor and steel morions shining as a harbinger of doom in the harsh directional light of sunlight breaking through the smoke brutally reflected the tragedy of this ruined place. A ruthless pacification began, a methodical roundup of every surviving inhabitant of the island. People who yesterday were free, proud owners of these fertile, blessed lands were now driven and herded into herds like worthless slaughtered cattle. The impact of heavy musket butts against fragile ribs, brutal curses shouted in the hard, guttural Dutch that sounded like a death sentence to the locals, and the constant heartbreaking cries of terrified children created a terrifying symphony of civilizational decline. Chaos reigned all around, but it was chaos fully controlled by the cold, ruthless discipline of the invaders. The half-naked, emaciated bodies of the Bandanians, with dark, burnt sienna-colored skin shining with sweat, contrasted dramatically with the deep, saturated reds of their executioners' uniforms, reminiscent of the color of congealed blood. Women clutched crying babies to their chests, trying to shield them from the blows with their own bodies, while old men stumbled and fell on the sharp, rocky paths, no longer having the strength to get up. Their dark, deep-set eyes, wide with unimaginable terror, desperately searched the soldiers' faces for any spark of mercy, but were met only with emptiness and indifference. They had been brutally confined to makeshift cramped camps, surrounded by rows of sharpened bamboo poles, where they now huddled in sticky, stinking mud, completely stripped of their human dignity, identity, and any hope for the future, instantly becoming mere nameless, meaningless statistics in the soulless accounting books of a powerful, merciless corporation. In the heart of this hell, like a dark god descending from the leaden heavens, appeared Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, a man whose ambition was as vast and cold as the ocean. His arrival at the camp was heralded by a sudden, unnatural silence, broken only by the clanking of spurs and the crunch of leather boots crunching against the ashen earth. Cohen was not a soldier driven by the fury of battle or a vengeful warlord. He was the epitome of a ruthless corporate calculator for whom a human life had value only if it brought a tangible profit in the form of guilders. Dressed in immaculate dark attire that seemed to absorb the light around him, he walked with his back straight, his face like a mask carved from the hardest marble. His sharp facial features, accentuated by the dramatic, deep shadows cast by the wide brim of his hat, gave him the appearance of a ruthless inquisitor.
Chapter 9. The Ghost Plantations.
When the thick, acrid smoke from the burning settlements finally began to descend, carried by slow, lazy gusts of monsoon wind, the soldiers of the Dutch East India Company saw a landscape of complete, devastating destruction that would change the history of this archipelago forever. The Banda Islands, once the vibrant, colorful heart of the global spice trade, were reduced to a ghostly graveyard where the silence rang in your ears with a deafening, almost physically painful force. Out of a population of over 15,000 proud, independent islanders, only a handful remained. Less than 1,000 terrified survivors who fled to the inaccessible volcanic mountains, while the rest were mercilessly murdered, exiled, or enslaved. The land which for centuries had been home to carved wood and palm-thatched houses was now covered with a thick layer of gray ash that looked like dirty snow in the brutal light of the equatorial sun. This ash mixed with the rusty red of the volcanic soil and dark, sticky stains of dried blood, creating a macabre palette worthy of the darkest visions of hell. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the main architect of this unimaginable massacre, achieved his macabre goal. The Banda Archipelago became the exclusive, absolute property of the company.
stripped of its indigenous population, ready to be brutally transformed into a wealth factory. This eerie, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of waves crashing on coral reefs and the cries of lonely birds, was a prelude to a new, terrifying order in which the beauty of a tropical paradise was forever sullied by a crime of unprecedented scale. Entering the ruined villages on the islands of Nera and Lontor was like walking slowly along the edge of a cooling hell, each step raising clouds of throat-irritating dust. The remains of the magnificent traditional kora boats that had once proudly cut through the azure waves of the Banda Sea with hundreds of rowers on board now lay shattered and burned on the white sand of the beaches, resembling the broken, blackened ribs of gigantic prehistoric beasts washed up on the ocean. The ruined temples and gathering places of the elders, known as Orankaya, were deliberately desecrated and their carved columns hacked for heartless company mercenaries. The wind, blowing from the direction of the Gunung Api volcano, blew through the charred skeletons of houses, making low, whistling sounds that, in the imagination of the few witnesses, sounded like the pained wailing of souls torn from their bodies only a few days earlier. What was most striking and grotesque about this scenery, however, was the smell, the omnipresent, sweet, almost intoxicating aroma of nutmeg and mace that wafted from the dense groves inland. This luxurious scent, coveted in royal courts throughout Europe, now mixed with the suffocating stench of burnt human flesh, sun-rotting bodies, and blood-soaked mud, creating the perfume of ultimate colonial depravity. The replacement of the organic chaos and natural order of the former inhabitants with a new, ruthless corporate logic began almost immediately before the earth had even had time to absorb the blood of the victims. East India Company surveyors and cartographers arrived on the islands armed with brass astrolabes, shiny compasses, heavy measuring chains, and rolls of thick parchment on which they would erase millennia of local history. Their brass instruments gleamed with a cold, alien glow in the bright, contrasting light, reminiscent of the sharpest paintings of the masters of Dutch chiaroscuro. With bureaucratic, icy precision, ignoring the natural terrain and sacred sites of the ancient Bandanese, they began to divide the islands into regular geometric agricultural plots, called perken in Dutch. 68 such plantations were precisely marked out, and every straight line drawn on the map was in fact
Chapter 10. The Last Nutmeg on Run. The brass telescope weighed like an anvil in Nathaniel Courthope's hands, its cold metal the only point of reference, albeit brutal, in the stifling thick air of the Run Island fort. Through a dirty, scratched lens that resembled an old man's hazy eye, the commander watched a horizon that heralded nothing but slow, inevitable death. The iron ring of blockade of the Dutch East India Company closed around this tiny volcanic lump of earth, the last bastion of English pride in the Banda archipelago. The ominous silhouettes of the VOC galleons stood out in terrifying sharpness against the sapphire ocean, their heavy hulls floating on the waves like bulky beasts awaiting carrion. Each ship was a fortress in itself, bristling with dozens of rows of cannons, their brass barrels gleaming in the blinding, unforgiving tropical sun. The light fell at a sharp angle, carving deep, velvety shadows on the decks of the Dutch ships, reminiscent of the raw, brutal brushstrokes of the old masters. Courthope felt a bead of salty, pungent sweat trickle down his dirty forehead, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. He stared at the flags flying on the masts, whose bright, saturated colors seemed to scream against the pale sky.
They were surrounded, cut off from the world, trapped in a trap with no way out, and each day the Dutch Armada waited was not an act of mercy, but refined torture. The Dutch did not have to storm the ruined walls of the fort. They did not have to risk an open war that could set the whole of Europe on fire. They just had to wait for hunger and disease to do their dirty work for them. And Courthope, trapped in this chiaroscure cage of stone and despair, could only watch helplessly as the noose around his garrison's neck tightened with each rise of the merciless equatorial sun. Additionally, the heavy, humid air carried with it a constant nauseating smell of decay, mixed with the paradoxically sweet, spicy aroma of nutmeg, creating a macabre contrast that kept the absurdity of their situation in mind. They sat on a mountain of unimaginable wealth for which empires spilled rivers of blood, and at the same time they had nothing to put in their mouths. In this claustrophobic space, where light fought against overwhelming darkness, Courthope realized that their fight was no longer just an armed conflict, but a test of the ultimate endurance of the human spirit against a soulless corporate monopoly machine that knew no concept of mercy. Run Island, this tiny inconspicuous point on the world map, became the epicenter of a global conflict, and its land, saturated with the smell of roots and blood, witnessed a tragedy of truly ancient proportions. It was here, among the dense tangled roots and spreading crowns of nutmeg trees, that the final act of the drama took place, in which what was at stake was not territory, but total control over the most valuable spice known to humanity at that time. Nutmeg, with its wrinkled, hard shell resembling an old man's dried skin, and its intensely red, almost bloody aril called mace, was worth more than its weight in pure gold in Europe. It was believed that it cured the plague, added vigor, and determined the social status of those who could afford it. For Courthope and his men, however, this spice became a curse, a death sentence handed down by the merciless logic of trade. Wading through mud and rotting leaves, they trampled on fortunes they would never experience, and the intense, intoxicating scent of nutmeg, carried by hot gusts of wind, permeated their clothes, skin, and hair, becoming a fragrant shroud for the living dead. This smell was everywhere, in the water that was slowly poisoning their bodies, in the remains of rotten wood, and even in the dreams that haunted them during the short, restless nights. The irony of fate was so palpable.
Chapter 11. The Fall of Captain Courthope. For 4 agonizing, unrelenting years, the tiny, nutmeg-rich island of Run had been a festering wound in the side of the Dutch East India Company, defended by a garrison of English ghosts who refused to die. Under the command of Captain Nathaniel Courthope, the men had endured a siege of such profound, starving cruelty that the very earth of the island seemed to groan under the weight of their collective suffering. The fort they held was a crumbling monument to human stubbornness, its wooden palisades splintered by countless Dutch cannonballs, its trenches filled with the foul, stagnant water of the monsoon rains. The men themselves were living skeletons, their skin stretched tight over prominent bones, their eyes hollowed out by disease, malnutrition, and the constant gnawing anxiety of an enemy that surrounded them on all sides. The atmosphere within the fortification was steeped in a heavy, suffocating gloom, painted in the somber, earthy browns and deep rusted reds of a Rembrandt canvas. The air was thick with the scent of rotting vegetation, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present, ironically sweet fragrance of the nutmeg that they were willing to die for. Shadows clung to the corners of the garrison like physical entities, devouring the meager light cast by sputtering, low-quality tallow candles. Yet, despite the grime that caked their faces and the threadbare, faded nature of their woolen uniforms, there remained a hardened metallic glint in the eyes of these defenders, a desperate resolve that mirrored the cold steel of their meticulously maintained muskets. They were men pushed to the absolute precipice of human endurance, surviving on little more than rainwater, scavenged roots, and the unyielding charisma of their captain, who walked among them like a weary titan wrapped in the velvety shadows of the tropical night. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Every creak of timber, every rustle of the dense jungle foliage sent spikes of adrenaline through their emaciated frames as they waited for the final, inevitable Dutch assault that would plunge them into the abyss. Then, like a piercing ray of stark directional sunlight cutting through the dense, stormy clouds of a Vermeer masterpiece, a rumor penetrated the suffocating blockade of the island. It arrived not with the blast of trumpets, but as a whispered salvation passed from the lips of a smuggled local fisherman to the ears of a shivering sentry. An English relief fleet was coming. The words themselves felt heavy, almost alien on the tongues of men who had forgotten what hope tasted like. The news spread through the garrison like a wildfire racing through dry timber, igniting a manic, disbelieving energy that transformed the atmosphere of the fort in an instant. The crushing, heavy chiaroscuro that had defined their existence was suddenly pierced by the golden, warming glow of salvation. Men who had not possessed the strength to stand mere hours before suddenly found themselves leaping from their filthy cots, their skeletal faces splitting into grins so wide they cracked their wind-chapped lips. The deep reds of dried blood and the drab ochre of mud were momentarily forgotten as the men embraced, their tears carving pale, shining tracks through the thick layers of dirt and gunpowder residue that masked their features. A ragged, feral howl of jubilation erupted from their throats, a sound born not merely of joy, but of a desperate, clawing need to survive. They dragged themselves to the highest points of the battlements, straining their sunken eyes toward the relentless horizon, searching the vast, indifferent expanse of the deep ocean blues for the glorious white canvas of English sails. Courthope himself stood among them, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword, a rare, guarded smile touching the corners of his mouth. The psychological shift was absolute. The oppressive, foreboding dread of the siege was entirely washed away, replaced by
Chapter 12. A swampy outpost called Manhattan. The cut is sharp, brutal, and breathless, like a sudden awakening from a feverish tropical dream straight into the icy embrace of a winter morning. We move from the steamy Banda Islands, smelling of nutmeg and blood, where volcanic peaks pierce emerald clouds and wealth flows in a wide stream to the vaults of the Dutch East India Company, to a place so different that it seems to belong to another planet. This is North America, or more precisely the harsh, unfriendly shores of the island that the local tribes call Mannahatta. The camera seems to be sailing through the turbulent steel-gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, approaching a land that greets visitors not with the promise of paradise, but with a menacing, gloomy silence. There are no spicy aromas here, which in Europe are worth more than gold, only the nostril-biting smell of rotting seaweed, wet wood, salt, and cold mud. The wind howls differently here, carrying no promise of monsoon rains, but cutting the skin like an icy blade, reminding anyone who dares to set foot here of the ruthlessness of nature. In an aesthetic reminiscent of the darkest works of the masters of the Dutch Golden Age, the landscape is bathed in dramatic chiaroscuro. Low, leaden clouds let through only rare, sharp shafts of light that barely penetrate the thick fog hanging over the swampy coast.
The golden era of Dutch painting finds its dark reflection here. It is not the rich bourgeois interiors of Vermeer, but raw, brutal landscapes full of deep velvety shadows and subdued earthy browns. The shift in perspective from the epic bloody theater of the Spice War to this isolated provincial outpost creates an almost physical sense of disorientation. The gang was the prize, the jewel in the crown, the place for which thousands were murdered. Manhattan is merely a disappointing strategic headache, a cold, muddy wasteland on the edge of an unknown, terrifying continent where survival is a daily, grueling struggle. Before we plunge into the muddy streets, a wide shot shows us the true, overwhelming scale of this undertaking and its complete insignificance compared to the power of nature. At the very southern end of a huge, wild and forested island, like a small, festering wound on the body of a sleeping giant, the settlement of New Amsterdam crouches. The forest stretches for miles to the north, dense, impenetrable, and formidable, full of ancient oaks, pines, and hickories whose trunks are thicker than the width of any Dutch wagon. Predators and unknown dangers lurk in these dark forests, and every rustle of leaves reminds the settlers that they are only uninvited guests here. The settlement itself looks pathetic. It is not a proud city of stone and brick, but a chaotic collection of flimsy wooden huts with thatched or shingled roofs, which seem to be desperately resisting the icy ocean winds. Smoke from the chimneys curls low above the ground, creating a gray suspension that mixes with the fog from the bay. Light and shadow play a brutal game here. Rare rays of sunlight reflect from puddles of frozen mud, while the alleys between the houses are immersed in impenetrable darkness, reminiscent of the darkest, patina-covered canvases by Rembrandt. There is no magnificent architecture or orderly canals of the native Amsterdam, only dirt, makeshifts, and a constant feeling of danger. Looking at this tiny speck of civilization, surrounded by endless, indifferent wilderness, it is clear what a fragile experiment this colony is. Fort Amsterdam, a proud-sounding name for crumbling earthworks with a few rusty cannons sticking out of them, looks more like a pile of sand than a real fortress. This is an outpost that brings no glory, generates no legends, but only consumes lives and fortunes in a bleak, muddy setting, where every day is a fight not to be swallowed up by the surrounding forest and the merciless waters of.
Chapter 13. The Anglo-Dutch Wars.
The microscopic speck of volcanic rock known as Run Island, once a distant whisper whispered in the dark, spice-scented taverns of Amsterdam and London, was now the bloody fulcrum on which the fate of the entire world rested. And its deeply wrinkled, deep scarlet nutmeg seeds acted like a spark on a powder keg, initiating an unprecedented global cataclysm. What began as merely a series of secret skirmishes and brutal murders in the stifling, malarious jungles of the Banda Islands, where rival traders slit each other's throats for a handful of aromatic nuts, now spread like a virulent plague across all oceans, evolving into the titanic struggles known to history as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The rivalry between England and the Republic of the United Provinces, which initially took place in the microcosm of the Moluccas archipelago, erupted with unimaginable full-scale fury, engulfing the entire globe and turning into a series of armed conflicts of unprecedented brutality. These wars were no longer just about exotic spices from the Far East, but now the stakes were absolute domination of global trade, monopoly of shipping routes, and supremacy of maritime empires. The Dutch East India Company and its English counterpart ceased to be mere associations of merchants and became militarized states within a state, ready to sink thousands of ships and sacrifice tens of thousands of lives just to gain an advantage in a growing, merciless world market, where the smell of cinnamon and cloves now mixed inextricably with the stench of burnt gunpowder and bodies rotting in salt water. The narrative of this epic competition suddenly shifts from the steamy, tropical equatorial waters to the bleak, cold, and stormy waters of the North Sea and the English Channel, where heavy, leaden clouds seemed to touch the turbulent waves. In these dark, hostile waters, where the fog was thick enough to cut with a knife and the bitter north wind froze the blood of sailors, the navies of England and the Netherlands prepared for a clash of epic proportions. The air was filled with the suffocating smell of salt, damp, rotting wood, and the omnipresent fear that choked the throats of even the most experienced sea wolves. Mighty warships, like floating fortresses of oak wood, emerged from the gray, dense fog like monstrous leviathans, their tall masts lost in the low-hanging clouds, and hundreds of brass cannon barrels protruded menacingly from the open ports, gleaming menacingly in the muffled, cold morning light. The aesthetic of the scene was reminiscent of a vivid, stark Rembrandt painting, with dramatic chiaroscuro lighting the tense faces of the sailors, the dirt and sweat covering their skin, and the rough texture of the thick canvas of the sails that flapped with a dull thud in the gusty wind. Waiting for the first shot was like torture. Each second seemed to drag on forever, and the only sound disturbing the pre-battle silence was the ominous creak of taut ropes and the crash of powerful waves against the massive hulls of ships. Suddenly, this stifling, sticky silence was brutally torn to shreds by the deafening, apocalyptic roar of hundreds of guns as the epic naval battle in the English Channel erupted in all its devastating fury. The colossal oak hulls of the English and Dutch galleons shook violently as a symphony of iron and black powder exploded from the lower decks, sending blinding flashes of sulfur-yellow fire that pierced with brutal force through the thick graphite fog. The air was immediately filled with acrid black smoke that burned your eyes and choked your lungs, transforming the battlefield into a surreal hellscape straight from your worst nightmares. Powerful cannonballs.
Chapter 14. The Most Unusual Deal in History.
The Second Anglo-Dutch War, which had consumed the waters of oceans and continents for years, reached the point of critical, devastating exhaustion in 1667. London, once the proud capital of the empire, was still smoking from the apocalyptic Great Fire that had consumed its heart just a year earlier, and the city's streets still bore the grim, silent testimony of the devastation inflicted by the merciless plague of the plague. In turn, the Dutch fleet, although buoyed by Admiral Mikhail de Ruyter's brilliant English humiliating raid on the Medway River, where the core of the royal fleet was burned, was in fact struggling with the last of its strength, and the treasury of the Republic of the United Provinces was suffocating under the weight of war expenses. Both sea powers, like two badly wounded gladiators in a blood-drenched arena, desperately needed a break from the slaughter. It was this desperation, masked by diplomatic hubris and silk robes, that brought the envoys of both nations to the small, damp, and cold city of Breda. North Brabant greeted them with leaden skies and rain that turned the roads into quagmire. Diplomats' carriages, dripping with mud, rolled heavily on the cobblestones, and inside them cold statesmen silently prepared for a clash that was to be as brutal and decisive as cannon salvos on the stormy North Sea. The atmosphere in the city was thick with tension, filled with the smell of wet wool, horse sweat, and chimney smoke, and every whisper in the alley seemed to herald a global reshuffle. It was here, in the shadow of brick walls and in the haze of political paranoia, that a peace treaty was to be forged which would not only end the bloodshed, but would unexpectedly shape the fundamental foundations of the modern world. The negotiation chamber itself, located in the heart of the Breda Castle, seemed like a come-to-life masterful canvas taken straight from the brush of Rembrandt or Vermeer himself, in which light and shadow waged their own silent war. The interior was immersed in a velvety darkness, broken only by a few wax candles set in heavy silver chandeliers, and a single sharp shaft of cool daylight barely breaking through the lead frames of the stained glass windows. Thick, almost tangible clouds of tobacco pipe smoke hung in the air, swirling lazily in the rays of light, creating a hypnotizing, suffocating fog. This smoke was mixed with the smell of damp plaster, old leather book covers, dried ink, and the sweat of men aware of the weight of responsibility resting on them. In the center of the room stood a massive oak table, the top of which was covered with deep scratches, scars from decades of political intrigue, betrayal, and fragile alliances. It was on this piece of furniture, resembling a sacrificial altar of modern diplomacy, that the fate of millions of lives, entire continents and fortunes undreamed of by ancient kings were to be laid. This setting, dripping with dark majesty and austere seriousness, was the perfect background for a drama in which the concepts of value, property, and territory were to be redefined in a way completely contrary to the logic of the time. On one side of this oak battlefield sat representatives of the English crown, led by Lord Denzil Holles, a man with a face like a mask carved from gray, cold stone. The English were dressed in severe, dark frock coats with high collars that seemed to suffocate them in a rigid corset of convention. There was a carefully hidden but palpable desperation in their eyes. King Charles II of England was playing the bank. His treasury was at the bottom, and the people of London were murmuring in revolt, blaming the monarchy for an endless series of natural disasters and military humiliations. Holles and his entourage knew they had to return to the British Isles with an agreement that the king could present as a triumph to calm tempers and save face.
Chapter 15. The Gilded Cage.
The Golden Age did not come quietly, nor did it descend gently on Amsterdam, with a force and ruthless splendor the likes of which Europe had never seen before, turning this once swampy, humble city into the pulsating heart of a global trading empire fueled by the blood and exotic aromas of the East. Walking along the newly dug Herengracht or Keizersgracht canals on a cool autumn evening, one could see the visual triumph of the East India Company written in brick, marble, and glass, where magnificent, monumental merchant residences rose from the mud like architectural monuments to unbridled greed. The light of the setting sun, reflecting in the murky waters of the canals, painted the facades of the buildings in colors of deep, saturated gold and rusty red, creating a natural, dramatic chiaroscuro that would soon be immortalized on the canvases of masters such as Rembrandt and Vermeer. Every carefully placed stone, every carved lintel, and every wide window in these houses was financed by the profit of nutmeg and mace, spices so valuable that their value in European markets exceeded their weight in pure gold. Wealthy townspeople, dressed in the softest Flemish cloths, heavy Spanish velvets, and fur-trimmed coats, strolled the cobbled streets as the surreal, almost intoxicating scent of burning peat hung in the air, mixed with the sharp, spicy notes of cinnamon, cloves, and mace wafting from nearby warehouses. This omnipresent aroma was a constant physical reminder of the source of their unimaginable wealth, a wealth that fueled the development of art, science, and philosophy, creating an era of unprecedented cultural flourishing that was essentially a beautiful, shining facade hiding the brutal, bloody reality of the Banda archipelago. The Dutch achieved their ultimate goal, an absolute, hermetic, and unchallengeable monopoly on the world's nutmeg supply, establishing an economic regime that lasted 150 years that changed the balance of power on the globe forever. But this spectacular triumph was soon to prove to be their greatest curse. In the cavernous, stuffy interior of one of these luxurious palaces, in the room that served as the unofficial decision-making center of the Heeren 17, the 17 powerful managing directors of the East India Company, the atmosphere was thick with conspiracy, greed, and unrelenting paranoia.
Behind a massive, intricately carved ebony table, imported from the furthest corners of Asia, sat a high-ranking VOC official whose sharp, stern face was illuminated only by the thin, trembling glow of a few wax candles, casting long, ghastly shadows on the walls, resembling the distorted silhouettes of monsters. In front of him, like a blasphemous altar erected in honor of trade, was a huge mountain of dried nutmeg seeds and blood-red mace arils, the intense resinous smell of which completely dominated the stuffy space of the office, giving a headache and dulling the senses. With almost lascivious fascination, the clerk dipped his hands, decorated with heavy gold signets, into the rough seeds, pouring them through his fingers and listening to their dull wooden rattle, which to his ears sounded like the most beautiful symphony of tinkling coins and endless profit. In his mind there was no room for sympathy for the slaughtered inhabitants of the Banda Islands. All that mattered was the merciless laws of supply and demand, mathematical equations that allowed him to artificially limit the availability of the spice on European markets, deliberately driving up its prices to such absurd, sky-high levels that only monarchs and the richest aristocrats could afford to buy it. This deliberate, callous strategy of creating artificial scarcity was the foundation of the company's power, but it required constant, exhausting vigilance and maintenance. In the cavernous, stuffy interior of one of these luxurious palaces, in the room that served as the unofficial decision-making center of the Heeren 17, the 17 powerful managing directors of the East India Company, the atmosphere was thick with conspiracy, greed, and unrelenting paranoia. Behind a massive, intricately carved ebony table, imported from the furthest corners of Asia, sat a high-ranking VOC official whose sharp, stern face was illuminated only by the thin, trembling glow of a few wax candles, casting long, ghastly shadows on the walls, resembling the distorted silhouettes of monsters. In front of him, like a blasphemous altar erected in honor of trade, was a huge mountain of dried nutmeg seeds and blood-red mace arils, the intense resinous smell of which completely dominated the stuffy space of the office, giving a headache and dulling the senses. With almost lascivious fascination, the clerk dipped his hands, decorated with heavy gold signets, into the rough seeds, pouring them through his fingers and listening to their dull wooden rattle, which to his ears sounded like the most beautiful symphony of tinkling coins and endless profit. In his mind there was no room for sympathy for the slaughtered inhabitants of the Banda Islands. All that mattered was the merciless laws of supply and demand, mathematical equations that allowed him to artificially limit the availability of the spice on European markets, deliberately driving up its prices to such absurd, sky-high levels that only monarchs and the richest aristocrats could afford to buy it. This deliberate, callous strategy of creating artificial scarcity was the foundation of the company's power, but it required constant, exhausting vigilance and maintenance.
Chapter 16. The Seed of the New World. A thick, almost tangible darkness enveloped the Banda Islands, lying on the volcanic soil like a heavy, velvety shroud that for over a century suffocated the archipelago in the iron grip of the Dutch monopoly, transforming this paradise into one large, blood-drenched plantation, where every leaf and every twig had its price expressed in human suffering. Pierre Poivre, a brave and determined French interloper, visionary, botanist, and spy in one person, moved silently like a ghost among the mighty old nutmeg trunks, his heart beating in his chest with deafening force, like the drums of the coming revolution. The air was unimaginably stuffy, saturated with the heavy, intoxicating smell of rotting leaves, fertile volcanic soil, and the sweet, spicy scent of the spice itself, which until then had been the exclusive, jealously guarded property of the United East India Company.
In the moonlight, which like a sharp silver blade cut through the dense canopy of the tropical treetops in a perfect chiaroscuro painterly style, reminiscent of Rembrandt's most dark and dramatic canvases, the Frenchman's face shone with sticky sweat and dirt, betraying the unimaginable tension that accompanied this act of daring theft. He knew perfectly well that the slightest rustle, the slightest mistake, or an accidental encounter with the heavily armed Dutch patrols that were constantly combing the island in search of smugglers would mean immediate brutal death for him, and his body would become just another nameless fertilizer for the precious trees under which he was currently sneaking. However, the stakes were too high, and the temptation to destroy the global monopoly and break the enemy's economic domination outweighed any fear, forcing him to plunge his hand into the damp earth in search of this one priceless treasure that was to change the course of history forever and move the center of gravity of world trade to completely new, previously unknown tracks. The Frenchman's hand, smeared with black fertile soil and trembling with excess adrenaline, plunged deep into the volcanic undergrowth, desperately searching for the delicate roots of young nutmeg seedlings, almost invisible in the darkness, which were more valuable to the company's ruthless managers than the purest gold, and whose export outside the archipelago was punishable by death. His every movement was slow, precise, and almost reverent, as if he realized that in those dirty, sweaty hands he held not only a small, inconspicuous plant, but above all the key to the destruction of the largest, most oppressive trade empire that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Pulling the plants gently from the ground, Poivre felt under his fingers the rough texture of the thin roots on which still rested clods of earth from the Banda Islands, soil soaked in the blood of tens of thousands of murdered natives and enslaved workers who gave their lives to satisfy the insatiable appetite of European aristocrats for exotic flavors. The dense shadows around him seemed to come to life, elongating and taking shape like the bony, greedy fingers of Dutch merchants, desperate to hold on to their wealth, while a lone shaft of moonlight illuminated his focused face, creating a composition of epic, historic weight. By placing the seedlings in specially prepared bags lined with moist moss and linen, the Frenchman performed an act of botanical espionage on an unprecedented scale, physically and symbolically tearing the heart out of the chest of a powerful monopoly, knowing that if these tiny seeds and shoots survived the journey, the world they had known would crumble to dust, giving way to a new, completely different era. Escaping under the cover of the merciless dark night towards the waiting ship was just the beginning of an epic, perilous odyssey.